So we see that insulin resistance is actually correlated very tightly with glucose hypometabolism in the brain, which is like very closely associated, if not causally, to blame for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. In fact, in Alzheimer's disease, you have about a 50% reduction in the brain's ability to generate energy from glucose. As I mentioned, there's vascular dysfunction. You can see like high blood pressure. So I think there could be toxic insult. I think there are many roads up the mountain, and it's probably going to be different for each person. But again, it's like we can't jump to blaming amyloid just because we see it there in the brain of a person who's died from Alzheimer's disease. What's causing it to be there is the question, right? Like what's causing the cholesterol to aggregate in our arteries in the setting of atherosclerosis, right? That's a question that I think we need to be asking, not let's just attack cholesterol and try to drive it as low as possible.
Today's show with Max Lugavere is brought to you by Myoscience. As you know, we're talking a lot about supporting brain health, supporting metabolic health, and one tool that I think is the most powerful natural compound to support metabolic health is Berberine Fasting Accelerator by Myoscience. What makes this unique is the combination of a high-potency berberine paired with synergistic nutrients, biotin, and alpha-lipoic acid. It's important to recognize that we can't diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease here. We're talking about supporting health, and berberine hydrochloride is a natural product that can support metabolic health. One thing that it's been shown to be able to do is accelerate the physiology of fasting. So one use case for this would be having it around dinner time, either before, during, or after dinner. And if you like to start your day off with a fast, maybe you're more in the late time restricted feeding camp, you don't feed until maybe 11 or 1 p.m. or something like that, you can take berberine in the morning as well. 1 to 2 capsules is a sufficient dose. So the URL to save is myoscience.com. That's Myoscience with an X, MYOXCIENCE.com, where you can save on the updated and improved Berberine Fasting Accelerator with the coupon code podcast to save 15%. I'll put links in the description below as well to that, and also to Max's amazing books. He's the author of Genius Foods and Genius Kitchen. He's an amazing person. He's coming out with a new documentary to help inspire nutrition and lifestyle change, to help people all throughout the world learn better tactics and strategies to improve the health of their brains and prevent the incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's that unfortunately he had an immediate family member succumb to. So it's an important conversation. I really hope you enjoy it. And let's cut back to it with Max Lugavere. So Max, it's great to have you back on the show to talk about all things brain health. You and I have been having these conversations for a number of years now when you lived in New York. And what I love about your book and your work is you're really helping people of our age, 30s, 40s, 50s, conceptualize how important it is with our choices as it relates to preventing degenerative brain conditions. So a lot has changed, in the last, your documentary and throughout your books and works and so forth, with regards to metabolic health, the importance of exercise. So just want to kind of revisit some of these concepts and maybe start off, because I think it was late August of 2022, the whole theory around the beta amyloid plaque being the main sort of etiological driver of the pathophysiology. There's a lot of questions around that about falsified images and this sort of thing. So how does that change the landscape of how we view preventing and also treating dementia and Alzheimer's?
Oh man, such a great place to start. Yeah, so the prevailing hypothesis as to what is the cause of Alzheimer's disease for the past, century really, since Alzheimer's was first coined by Alois Alzheimer, has been that amyloid beta is the cause of the condition. Similar to cholesterol, right? When you open up the body of a cadaver that has passed due to, for example, atherosclerotic disease, and you see these cholesterol-aligned arteries. It's very seductive, very simplistic enough to sell to the public, and seductive enough in terms of optics to sell to a physician that cholesterol is the driver of heart disease, right? But obviously, biology in many ways is very often more complicated and than the eye can see, essentially. And that is, I think, what we're starting to understand about Alzheimer's disease, and what certainly many, I think, practicing neurologists in the field have believed for some time. But the dominating hypothesis, really, within the industry and within the industry of research as well as pharma, has been that amyloid is the cause. It's a very druggable hypothesis, right? If you can come up with a drug that's going to somehow clear amyloid out of the brain, then somehow you've got a winner. But again, all that for the most part has been based on ultimately speculation, because you see and correlation, really, because you see amyloid there in the brain in the extracellular space between neurons of somebody who's died from Alzheimer's disease, along with, of course, widespread neuronal death, brain shrinkage, and the like. But they could never really connect amyloid to the clinically meaningful symptom, right? The symptom that we want to improve for a patient who's suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and that is memory impairment, right? Until this 2006 paper came out, published in the journal Nature, which is like, if you get published as a scientist in the journal Nature, it's like winning an Academy Award, right? And so what this paper did was it showed that there was this amyloid beta subtype called A beta star 56 that, when injected into the body of a young mouse, that they started to exhibit profound cognitive dysfunction. And so that paper served as the missing link, especially at a time when faith in this hypothesis was starting to wane, because they were unable really to connect amyloid with cognitive dysfunction, right? And so what this paper did was it showed, using a Western blot, which is a sort of visual way of illustrating protein concentration. They showed that this missing link existed. Now, since then, other groups have tried to find A beta star 56. They've failed. But what this paper did really well was it renewed fervor. And it served as validation to the industry, to the so-called amyloid mafia, right? Like scientists who've built their careers and reputations on this amyloid hypothesis. I am not a medical doctor, and I don't work in pharma, and I didn't take an academic path, but I myself have seen the power of this mafia, because when I first got started, my first appearance on your show, I was in the midst of production on a documentary about dementia prevention, using lifestyle means, dietary and lifestyle means, to prevent this condition, using the best available evidence, right? We don't know everything, but we certainly have enough answers, I think, where we're at a time, and we can talk about these recommendations, but we're at a time where we don't have to sit idly on our hands, right, as we await what's in our genetic destiny, so to speak. And an op-ed was written in the Wall Street Journal disparagingly talking about me and my film, along with other alternative therapies that are sort of talked about, in the social media wellness space. Now, granted, there's a lot of BS in the social media wellness space, right? But this paper was a direct illustration of this amyloid mafia coming out against alternate viewpoints to the amyloid hypothesis. Now, what was recently revealed, this expose published in the magazine Science, was that those Western blot illustrations were fraudulent. They were faked. And this was discovered by a Vanderbilt researcher who was dabbling in these message boards that are all about post-publication peer review. So peer review, the way that peer review works is an article generally gets peer reviewed by anonymous reviewers prior to its publication. And these peer reviewers, they're not image sleuths, right? They're not like going in with Photoshop and looking at the validity of these like images that are presented, right? That's not what they're doing. They're looking at the data. They're like crunching the numbers, looking at methodology and things like that, looking for bias. They're not like going in and running like image software to make sure that these images are accurate or authentic. But on this message board, people had been doing that. And what was revealed by this guy, Matthew Schrag, was that these images, there was crystal clear evidence that these images were fake, that they were faked. And what that did was again, that paper, it renewed fervor for this hypothesis. It continued the funding pipeline, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It continued to validate these reputations and allow this so-called amyloid mafia to fester and to ridicule alternate viewpoints, right? Like really well-meaning alternate viewpoints that had like real plausibility. And yeah, it's a really sad story. And that's not to say that the amyloid hypothesis has been completely disproven. Like what science does is it reduces uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I still think that there has to be accountability for something like that.
And do you think there will be legal action? Does he still have a job at University of Minnesota? Or I haven't followed it.
I know. I've tried to follow. There have been no updates, so I don't know. But you can kind of see this in action. There was a drug that was approved by the FDA fairly recently, and I talked about this recently on the Rogan episode that I did. But that a drug called aducanumab was actually given the green light by the FDA. It was fast tracked to approval because it was effective at reducing amyloid in the brain, but it didn't improve cognitive symptoms, which is like what we want to improve for a patient, right, with Alzheimer's disease. And it came with really significant side effects and the like. And actually 8 people on the panel of 11 begged essentially the FDA not to greenlight it, and they greenlit it anyway. Yeah.
Was that the drug that came out in like June of 2021? It's been out for a little, because I know there was it was very expensive, controversial.
Yes.
Okay. So these side effects, were they neurologic related side effects? Like, did they worsen the condition, or they were systemic issues? Like what?
What they did was they led to, I think in about 35% of patients, brain swelling. And then about half of those patients had bleeding associated with that swelling, because it's an antibody essentially. So it gets your immune system to attack this amyloid protein, right? But that's that what you're doing is you're creating an immune response in the brain,
which is not good.
There was another drug. It's definitely worth mentioning that there was another drug that made headlines recently called lecanemab, which is a similar type of drug, antibody to amyloid beta. And the data hasn't been revealed yet, and to my knowledge, it hasn't undergone peer review. But what they showed was that this drug did reduce amyloid in the brain, but it also led to a slowing of cognitive decline. That's not to say that this proves the amyloid hypothesis, but we do know that amyloid at a certain point becomes toxic, right? Because it's just gumming up the works in the brain. Mm-hmm. So for somebody with mild Alzheimer's disease, which was the population cohort studied in this trial, it seemed to have a slowing effect. Again, not a cure, and the data hasn't been revealed yet. But again, I think that ultimately, what this further confirms to me is the value of prevention, that we really want to do what we can to make sure that this amyloid isn't over aggregating to begin with.
Mm-hmm. And view this as a holistic approach.
Yeah.
Nutrition, exercise, lifestyle, maybe looking at genetic susceptibility, which I want to get into all of that. But furthermore, to me, what this helps us to better understand is censorship in science is bad, because this was not like a regulatory body that discovered these falsified images. This was peers. And when we silence the peers, which has happened over the course of COVID, we've seen this with heart disease. Even doctors now in California, their medical license is at risk for questioning the so-called, contemporary consensus. So I really like this as an example for people to remember that science is not always perfect. And there can be, we don't know the intentions of falsifying these images, if they're financial or personal, whatever. But this paper was a high impact paper, cited 2,000 some odd times. And, again, if we have these high impact papers and we just assume, oh, it's published in Nature, oh, it's in JAMA, so it must be good, or it's Lancet, whatever. And I think this is just a good example to lead off with, because there was another, I'm sure you saw this study, it was a meta-analysis of the outcomes using SSRIs. And because with regards, if you could characterize, beta amyloid as a driver of the etiology of Alzheimer's, we can look at, depression is really a serotonin, challenge. And, did you see that meta? I think it was August as well, or early September, showing that, the long-term effect of SSRIs in particular are not so much associated with outcomes when it comes to depression. So so I think it's important that we all remember this, because a lot of people, and maybe not our audience, thinks, oh, I'm sick, I take this drug. I have allergies, I take this. I have Alzheimer's. Oh, just take that drug, you're going to be fine. But really, the solutions are within us, within our own biochemistry and lifestyle. So,
yeah, I mean, I like to say that these drugs, what they do is they work via singular pathways, right? Or at least the pathways that we're able to identify with our meager tools, right? I mean, we think that we know everything, right? Well, I think humans have, especially humans that feel compelled to go into scientific academia, right? We have this God complex, but nature always finds a way to outsmart us, and that's why I think like when you do something, when you take a more, for lack of a better term, holistic approach, like you build in an exercise habit, right, into your day, you're not just affecting like one or two pathways. You're taking a shotgun to your problems. You're affecting all of these myriad different pathways, right? And exercise is like the perfect example of that with regard to brain health. I think exercise is like, I mean, if there were to be something like a magic bullet, like exercise would essentially be it, right? It's not a cure all. Like you can't, if you are already diagnosed with a condition like Alzheimer's disease, exercise, could potentially slow the condition. It's not a cure, but I do think that it is one of the best tools that we have at our disposal towards prevention.
And it's talked about in scientific wellness circles, but and that paper that you just posted on your Instagram sometime last week, Scientific Reports, a subjournal of Nature, basically concluded, I didn't read it, but concluded that essentially exercise should be frontline medicine or care for the prevention of dementia, Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, what this, it was a paper actually published in Scientific Reports. So on social media, I wrote that it was published in Nature. It was actually published by Nature, which publishes all these other subjournals and the like. But nonetheless, it was a paper that looked at all of the data on gene dysregulation in Alzheimer's disease. Now, the question is gene dysregulation a cause of Alzheimer's disease, or is it a downstream effect, right? Maybe the amyloid overaggregation in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease causes genes to misfire, which is very probable, right? Nonetheless, this paper looked at all the different gene dysfunction, genes related to inflammation, genes related to amyloid clearance and the like, things like that. And then it looked at all of the available data on substances and activities that could potentially affect gene regulation, right? Curcumin was one of the candidates. A whole bunch of drugs were a candidate, but then they included exercise because there is good data on exercise from rodent models. And what they found was that in the top 3 slots for their potential to correct the dysregulation that is seen in Alzheimer's disease, exercise took those spots. That it was like this like incredible magic bullet. And I posed the question on social media: why isn't this like front page news? And yeah, so that's just like one example. That's like one example. But exercise does all of these really important things. It's crucial for helping to normalize blood pressure. It's important for glucose disposal, for insulin regulation. It's one of the best ways to support insulin sensitivity in the body. There was actually a meta-analysis just published of RCTs that utilized different types of exercise in the setting of mild cognitive impairment. And what they found was that resistance training was actually the most effective at slowing cognitive decline.
That is so interesting, because when you look at some of the research, for example, looking at what type of exercise most dramatically increases BDNF, it's usually biased towards aerobic or cardiovascular based training. But this particular research is emerging showing resistance training.
Well, I think the reason for that is that it's from a basic science standpoint, it's easy to get a mouse to run on a treadmill, right? Or to keep a mouse sedentary and see what happens, like compare what's going on in the brains of those two mice, right? It's a lot more difficult to do that with a living person. And so I think that there has been a bias for some time now in the literature with regard to aerobic exercise. But yeah, the data is pouring out, seemingly showing us that resistance training is just as important, if not more so.
Mechanistically, I mean, we don't know, it's speculation, but why would you think that would be?
Well, when you resistance train, I think it's from a whole body hormonal milieu standpoint. I mean, resistance training is important for helping clear sugar from the blood. So particularly in the context of the standard American diet, where your average American is sedentary and consuming 300 grams of carbohydrates a day, primarily from refined grain products, that anything that's going to help your body more efficiently clear that glucose from the blood, and with less requiring less insulin to do the job to boot, because in the post-workout window you've got insulin independent glucose uptake. I think that's a good thing. We've talked about, your muscles being a glucose disposal sink. I think that's really important. When you exercise, your muscles produce myokines. So these are compounds that are able to travel up to the brain, and many of which have been shown to have a supportive effect. I think BDNF is one of them.
That is fascinating.
And also resistance training is really important for fostering anti-fragility. There was another study that, and I'll send you the link. I'm forgetting the journal, but essentially what it found was that among people who were at high genetic risk for developing dementia, that it was really frailty that was the needle mover, right? Like so those that were frail were like much more inclined, I think by 3 times more inclined to develop dementia than those that were not frail. And frailty is a measure of robustness, of vigor, right? And I think resistance training is a great way. It's, if not the most important way to foster resilience. I mean, it helps you to continue to stay mobile. Our brains suffer when we're sedentary, and they thrive in a body that moves. And I think when, making sure that you're able to stay mobile as you age, crucially important.
It's so important. I'm reading this book by Robert Greene called Mastery. And he talks about, in the Western world, we sort of characterize intelligence with the ability to communicate with words and use our brains to do certain things. But historically, people use their hands. Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, these people would work with their hands and their brain at the same time. It's more tactile. And it seems like weightlifting is more tactile. Resistance training, you're doing push-ups, you're doing pull-ups, you're picking up stuff. When you're just, and I'm not trying to say running is not effective or whatever, but you're just kind of like going through the motions. You're not introducing any novel tactile movements. So I wonder if that's a piece of it as well.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, skill-based training, I guess you could count exercise as one type of skill-based training, I think is really important. I experienced this because I'm not an athlete. Like I've been into fitness my whole life, but I think where sports I think are really valuable is that they teach you to have like this like whole body concert of activity, right? Of coordination, right? Like to hit a golf ball even, or to swing a baseball bat, or to shoot a basketball. It's like this whole body concert of movement that has to all fall into line for you to like shoot the basketball properly. And I don't know how to do that, right? So because I'm not an athlete, but I did over the course of the pandemic begin taking private boxing lessons, which is again one of these types of activity where it's the whole body is involved, right? And I think it's been incredible for of course my fitness, it's a wonderful workout, but for that hand-eye coordination aspect of things, for just like, getting your whole body to move in concert is super, super effective. Yeah.
It's so important. And a lot of people forget one of the main adaptations with training is actually first a primary neurological. So if you and I start lifting weights and we're doing something different, it's not that our muscles are getting stronger right away. The adaptation that occurs before all that is neurologic based. So you wonder if that neurology plays into it. So I think, we can speculate, but the important thing is when you go to the gym and you see elderly people, usually they're on a treadmill or an elliptical, not so frequently lifting weights. And so it's just good to reemphasize that.
Well, also these growth factors like IGF-1, and I'm not so sure about mTOR, but I know that IGF-1 is really important with regard to neuroplasticity, right? And so like there's this concern, especially if you peek into the more plant-based pockets on the internet, that IGF-1 is bad, or that like stimulating these growth pathways like mTOR is bad. But growth certainly at certain phases of our life, but with regard to our brains, I think growth is we want to encourage cycles of growth as we, particularly as we age, with regard to our muscle tissue, but also in the brain. Like IGF-1 is an important stimulator of neurogenesis,
Mhm.
right? Which is the growth of new brain cells.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I know that's something that you've been wanting to talk about for a while. And that research is so fascinating, particularly because people are doing any and everything to reduce chronically IGF-1, fasting all the time, hypocaloric diets, these longevity anti-aging. There's like, like you said, pockets on the internet, Facebook groups,
Yeah.
really low protein diets. But again, it's like the literature is right there, particularly over the age of 65.
Yeah.
Low IGF-1 is directly correlated with mortality. So it adheres to a U-shaped curve, and that the context is lost there. Like you mentioned, it's really good for the brain. Chronic overexpression might induce neoplasms or cancer formation, but
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I think it's like, in what environment are you encouraging growth, right? Are you encouraging growth in a toxic environment, like, in the body of a person who's consuming sugary foods, sugar sweetened beverages, smoking, exposed to environmental pollutants, sedentary, refined grain products day in and day out? Or are you encouraging growth in a body that's like, eats a very healthy diet and is like exercising regularly and is exposing their brain regularly to novel environments, enriched environments? I mean, I'm far from an expert in cancer, so I'll just lay that out there. I'm not an expert in cancer, but like, people will say that dairy is a powerful stimulator of this IGF-1 pathway, right? But dairy is an important, and I've changed my tune with regard to dairy over the past couple of years. If you think about what develops first in a neonate, it's the nervous system. It's the central nervous system. It's the brain, right? So if you look at dairy has some like really interesting compounds in it that seem like specially placed to help support brain health. So to me, it's not surprising that dairy would stimulate IGF-1, right? It's not surprising to me that the phospholipids that you see in dairy are rich in phosphatidylcholine, in sphingomyelin, which is an important component of myelin, right? The myelin sheath. So yeah, I think we have to think about all these things, and we often don't, or at least, there's this like sort of reductionist view of things as they're delivered by certain diet cults that that demonize one food group or another, which I think is counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. I love that we're talking about this because I am a fan of dairy, particularly raw dairy. I would love to know your sources and what you think. But what's interesting, because it dovetails back to what we were talking about with muscle. There was a study in elderly people new to exercise. They had a placebo group that didn't consume any dairy after, and then another group that had milk. And the group that had the milk, I know milk's considered bad and all this by some people, gained more muscle and had a better response to the exercise sessions because they were recovering better. So I've incorporated raw dairy into my post-exercise, routine, and I love it. I'm a huge fan. But what do you consume, and how do you? Is it raw cheese, raw dairy? Do you ever have pasteurized milk? How do you view all that?
Yeah, I haven't, I like when I start to investigate a given food group or topic or whatever, I go one step at a time. So right now for me, it's been like, okay, dairy is back on the table. I feel fine when I consume it. I'm not lactose intolerant. I try to reach for primarily full fat dairy, but I'm not against fat-free dairy in certain contexts. Like I regularly will consume the fat-free, like Greek yogurt, because to me that's like a protein supplement, right? Like there's nowhere else that you're going to get 19 grams of protein in an 80-calorie serving. And Greek yogurt to me is like, it's a great, like essentially a protein supplement. You get a little bit of probiotics in there as well. I'm also a big fan of cottage cheese. I've been putting heavy cream in my coffee, which I think is super, super tasty. So yeah, I haven't really gone down the rabbit hole in terms of like the difference between raw and not raw. I mean, I know that homogenization can change the biochemical makeup of like the milk fat globule membrane, which is part of what we want when we consume dairy. But it's very interesting that when they've done studies in infants where they'll feed, or children, or both, where they'll feed dairy that's been depleted of milk fat globule membrane, and then they'll feed the milk fat globule membrane. They see that milk fat globule membrane actually has a beneficial effect on cognitive function in children, which is that phospholipid sort of bubble that encapsulates the triglycerides in dairy. So I think dairy fat is wonderful, and to me, it makes perfect sense that it would be supportive of brain health. There's not a lot of good data on dairy as it pertains to like dementia, so I don't want to, speak irresponsibly about it. But there was one paper that came out There's a researcher whose work I've been familiar with for some time. His name is Oriel Willett. He does a lot of like papers on diet, nutrients as they pertain to brain health. And it was like this like food frequency questionnaire study. But what they found was that among food components or food categories, dairy was seemingly was like the one that had the strongest correlation with better brain health.
Wow.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm
That's
not gonna
so awesome.
I'm not gonna claim that that's a causal connection, but it was just interesting, you know. So more research needs to be done, but yeah, I'm a fan of dairy at this point.
Me too. And I guess I'm guilty over the years. We think of corn, wheat, soy, dairy as kind of like the main four allergens that maybe people should avoid if they have gastrointestinal issues, food allergies, skin issues. But yeah, I think for some people, if they want to reintroduce it, I'm a big fan. I know there's concern about having unpasteurized raw dairy because of the bugs and the pathogens and things like that. But in various cities, you can find this now. I mean, whether it's my cousin in New York, it's like an underground network. This guy in a white van shows up on a Sunday and you pay him cash and whatnot. But I don't know. I'm a big fan, and I have noticed just better recovery from exercise. My daughter loves it. So yeah, I think
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, like the dairy that I consume, most of it is not raw. Like I buy like heavy cream that doesn't say raw on it. The yogurt that I buy is not raw. Although I wonder how. I guess they pasteurize the yogurt to
introduce bacteria
and then introduce the bacteria back into it. Yeah, I don't really know how it works, but
yeah.
but fascinating.
That's super fascinating. Yeah, I love that. Going back to, let's put a button on the beta amyloid. Could it be that there's some underlying neurologic dysfunction? Like if we sort of make an analogy with cardiovascular disease, you look at the macrophages, and getting oxidized LDL triggers this whole macrophage, and then the atherosclerotic process, right? Could it be that we're looking at a repair mechanism? Like the amyloid could be repairing neurodegeneration that is occurring, and we're trying to. Was that part of the? I haven't looked at this, so I would love to know your perspective. Is that part of what could be happening?
Yeah, it seems that amyloid is a protective, like a protective response. Like amyloid, the presence of amyloid is a protective response to the brain's immune system. They've done research at Harvard where they will introduce in culture viruses like the herpes simplex virus, and they'll see amyloid sort of encapsulate quite elegantly the virus. So it's probably a response to some kind of inflammatory insult in the brain, and I think that where that insult is coming from probably differs patient to patient. I think for some it could be vascular insult, right? It could be like vascular dysfunction, which we know is one of the first things to go south, so to speak, in Alzheimer's disease. For some, I think it could be a blood sugar regulation problem. For example, chronic hyperglycemia is associated with an impaired ability for glucose to enter the brain. So we see that insulin resistance is actually correlated very tightly with glucose hypometabolism in the brain, which is like very closely associated, if not causally, to blame for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. In fact, in Alzheimer's disease, you see about a 50% reduction in the brain's ability to generate energy from glucose. As I mentioned, there's vascular dysfunction. You can see like high blood pressure. So I think there could be toxic insult. There are many roads up the mountain, and it's probably going to be different for each person. But again, it's like we can't jump to blaming amyloid just because we see it there in the brain of a person who's died from Alzheimer's disease. What's causing it to be there is the question, right? Like what's causing the cholesterol to aggregate in our arteries in the setting of atherosclerosis, right? That's a question that I think we need to be asking. Not let's just attack cholesterol and try to drive it as low as possible. And I always remain open to being proven wrong, right? Like maybe amyloid is the cause. Maybe cholesterol is the cause here. But I just think that to me that seems too simplistic, right? Like what's causing these compounds that our bodies naturally create in the presence of health to suddenly become pathologic and dysfunctional?
It's a great point. With regards to COVID, there has been some research suggesting that a prior COVID infection might worsen cognitive abilities and exacerbate dementia and Alzheimer's. Have you been following that data at all?
I haven't, but I mean, it's interesting because like when an older person has, for example, like a urinary tract infection, they'll see if they, especially if they're already suffering from dementia, they'll see worsening cognitive dysfunction. I actually saw this with my mother. I mean, it's difficult to talk about, but my mom, in about 3 months prior to her passing, her cognition took a marked dip. Like it got worse really fast, and in tandem with that, she developed jaundice, and we found out that it was not due to a gallstone, but due to the presence of a tumor on her pancreas. And jaundice is caused by bilirubin, which backs up in the blood. It causes your skin to turn yellow, the whites of your eyes to turn yellow, and it's ultimately toxic. It's the pigment that gives stool its color. And when they discovered that the tumor, what they did was they stented my mom's bile duct to allow the bilirubin to drain properly into the GI tract. And almost overnight, her cognition improved, like dramatically. Like it had regressed like 3 years prior. And all that is to say that we know that, especially for somebody who already has dementia, some kind of cognitive dysfunction, or any neurologic condition that added inflammation, you're adding inflammation into the system, it can make things a lot worse. So I mean, with going back to COVID, I think I don't know much about that topic, but it's not inconceivable to me that it would exacerbate cognitive issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, regarding that, there was some interesting research about the olfactory nerve and the olfactory bulb being atrophied, particularly after a COVID infection, and that being associated with cognitive decline. There's other research showing that. So I was wondering, early on 2020, if there would be an association there. What is it with olfaction and smell and its correlation with symptomology as it relates to dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the first senses to go awry and to indicate a potential for some type of cognitive dysfunction. I remember when I was engaged with the work at Weill Cornell, they were starting to study like early scent tests to try to detect preclinical Alzheimer's disease, which is super important. Like that's a really important window to intervene, right? For somebody who's like at risk who's like severely at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But yeah, it's just, I mean, I guess it's like the sense that's most directly connected to the brain. So it's the one that you can sort of, that you can see signs of early on. But it's interesting because for me with COVID, everybody that I know lost their sense of taste and smell. I didn't, which was very, very odd. Yeah.
You're doing so much to, mitigate that potentially.
Potentially. Yeah. I mean, my neurologist was very surprised. And he said that's probably a very good thing. And we don't know, but yeah, I don't know anybody else who didn't lose their sense of smell or taste. So I don't know, maybe I'm doing something right.
That's amazing.
After all this,
right? I mean, I certainly lost mine, but it came back. But that was the major symptom that I had, because I just felt like I had a cold. Then I was eating food. And I'm like, wait, this doesn't taste normal. Like it just was muted a little bit. Then it returned. But I do know people who had a really hard time with COVID and are metabolically unhealthy, and their sense of smell still has not returned since.
Wow.
And I wonder if that's, talking about ways to ascertain our brain health. If we think about hearing, vision, sense of smell, sense of taste, I mean, these are all things that are intimately connected with brain function, not just the ability to articulate words and memories. So I'm thinking that for young people, if you're losing your sense of smell or taste, or you can't see very well, if these could be potentially warning signs early on that you might need to accelerate, lifestyle change.
Yeah. I mean, that is the holy grail, finding indicators that would be able to indicate who is most at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, so that we can intervene. It's kind of similar with Parkinson's disease. Most people don't know this, but constipation is a very early preclinical sign of impending Parkinson's disease, which is important because by the time you show up to your neurologist with your first symptom of Parkinson's disease, movement symptom of Parkinson's disease, half of the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra are already dead. So yeah, that is sort of the holy grail with regard to like all of these different neurodegenerative conditions, which are so hard to treat, right? It's finding like what's the sign that's going to like where are the breadcrumbs that are going to clue us into these conditions, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years prior to their onset.
What about vision? Is there any research on showing like vision decline in your 30s or 40s? Is that associated with cognitive decline? And the reason why I asked this question, and have you had Huberman on your podcast yet?
A while ago, but
Okay.
not recently. Yeah.
He talks about the eyes and helps people conceptualize the eyes are the only neurologic tissue that sort of exists outside the brain.
Yeah.
And that was an aha moment to me, because if you feel good, you wake up, you slept good, your vision is good. You don't, and some people will notice that when they make healthy lifestyle changes, and myself, I didn't need glasses anymore.
It's
So-
very interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can speak to the fact that we know that nutrients that are good for the eyes are very good for the brain. And in particular, well, first of all, any fat soluble antioxidants like vitamin E, really important for good eye health, for good brain health. But in particular, the carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin, and even astaxanthin, which is a marine carotenoid. But the evidence really on lutein and zeaxanthin is incontrovertible at this point, very supportive of good eye health as well as good brain health. And we know that those are nutrients that are particularly thought of within the context of eye health with regard to helping to prevent age-related macular degeneration. Another interesting, because we're talking about senses, hearing loss has been identified as fairly recently as a significant risk factor for developing dementia, which is really important. So you want to make sure that you're protecting your hearing. One really interesting hack that that I have to protect my hearing that I think is pretty important, nobody's really talking about it, is the role of magnesium. So after being exposed to really loud noise, I make sure to take between 300 and 400 milligrams of magnesium, which is generally like a full day's worth. But you want to take it after loud noise exposure. It can help to protect your hearing. It reduces the risk of noise-induced hearing loss. They've done a number of these studies, not very recently, so they're pretty old studies, but they're done with like servicemen who were exposed to
Gunfire and-
yeah. Because I mean, you couldn't expose a civilian, right, to damaging levels of noise, right? But servicemen, women, people that are working on like aircraft carriers, for example, exposed to very loud noise all the time. And so there have been randomized controlled trials where they've used magnesium, and they find that magnesium is an effective prophylactic for noise-induced hearing loss, which is a risk factor for dementia.
Interesting. That's so fascinating. I mean, I think I love live music and going to concerts, but the downside there is if you forget earplugs or don't have them, your ears are kind of ringing. And that I never felt comfortable. I never do feel comfortable when your ear, that's a sign you were overstimulating your ears, so just 300 to 400 milligrams of magnesium after.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the dose. Like that's the ballpark dose that is used in these trials. And I forget the mechanism, but yeah, I remember sort of uncovering this line of research some years ago, and it's been a staple for me. Because I'm a big music nerd, so I love music, and the idea of like losing my hearing faculties to me is like would just be a nightmare. So anything I can do to protect my hearing.
Yeah. I think mechanistically, just because I've looked at the magnesium L-threonate, it affects with the overexcitation and the calcium signaling. It helps to rebalance that. I don't know if it's specific to ear loss or the sensation of sound, but could be.
Yeah, that rings a bell. I mean, I think that I recall reading something about that years ago. But yeah, big magnesium fan.
Love it. Me too. Going back to blood sugar and the inability to create cellular energy within the brain, and this whole notion, Susan Kraft, and I think it was 2009 or something, coined the term type 3 diabetes. It's been a long time since I've looked at that evidence, that data. Where does that stand? And is that a subtype? If we think of the subtypes of dementia and Alzheimer's, maybe some people you mentioned have vascular dysfunction, which could lead to their symptomology. Maybe others, it's a metabolic dysfunction. Where does the science stand with regards to insulin resistance in the brain?
Well, 80% of patients with Alzheimer's disease are insulin resistant. Not everybody with type 2 diabetes, which is defined by pathologic insulin resistance are going to develop Alzheimer's disease, but your risk increases between 2 and 4-fold if you have type 2 diabetes. 1 in 3 people is pre-diabetic, so they're on their way there. And this is a problem because chronically elevated blood sugar damages the little microvessels that supply blood, oxygen, nutrients, antioxidants to the brain. And so, yeah, we do know that insulin resistance, it seems to play a role. The degree of insulin resistance that one has is correlated to, as I mentioned, the degree of hypometabolism in the brain. And in the brain, what you end up seeing, so type 2 diabetes is defined by insulin resistance. Type 1 diabetes is insulin deficiency. And what you see in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease is both insulin deficiency and tolerance, resistance. So it is an interesting situation, and that's why I think, in lieu of all the answers, I think it makes a lot of sense to just make sure, as with many conditions, that the best way to boost your resilience to them is to make sure that your body is in the most pristine metabolic health that it can be.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned with exercise, there's insulin independent glucose uptake. Is that systemic or also in the brain as well? I haven't looked at
post exercise. That's an interesting question. I actually, yes, in the post exercise window, exercise actually does help to, I believe, improve. Yeah.
In the brain as well.
Yeah. People who are genetically at risk for developing out like ApoE4 carriers, exercise seems to negate the effect of that gene. Probably there's different, myriad pathways as to how this works. But yeah, I believe that exercise does have the effect of improving brain glucose metabolism, which would make sense because it improves, peripheral glucose metabolism as well.
Mm-hmm. I would love to dive a little bit deeper into ApoE4 if you're comfortable with that. I'm a 3-4 carrier.
Same.
Haven't cut out fat from my diet or done these different things. It seems that the literature, from what I gather, is showing that if you are metabolically healthy, the genotype is not so sensitive or specific, as it relates to the future development. What do you think about, like, okay, if you're a 4-4, if you have one allele, should you really go on a low fat diet? All of that,
Yeah, I'm not a fan of low fat diets. I think that the way that I approach it, for me being a 3-4, is I think that we do have to be mindful of like lipids and things like that. But I think with every food, there's going to be a risk benefit analysis has to be performed. So for example, for me, like I've relegated butter, for example, which lacks milk fat globule membrane, and so therefore actually can have an adverse effect on blood lipids. I've relegated butter to more of like a YOLO indulgence food in my diet. Whereas, like red meat, for example, which, obviously has fatty acids in it that are capable of raising your ApoB. There are also benefits of eating red meat. The benefits include being a source of taurine, of carnitine, of carnosine, of creatine, of vitamin E, of, a small amount of omega-3 fats, and of course protein. So, that kind of food I am very comfortable keeping in my diet, and I try to go for grass-fed, grass-finished, which is going to ensure a leaner animal, right? And it also is going to ensure higher levels of stearic acid, which have a neutral effect on blood lipids. So I think it's a little bit about balance there. I think for ApoE4 carriers, eating fibrous vegetables and things like that. Fiber is really important for trapping bile acids in the gut, which can help in a really significant way regulate blood lipids and things like that. I think things like, how you drink your coffee can also have an effect, or how you brew your coffee, rather. We know that when you brew coffee with a French press, you're leaving diterpenes like cafestol in the brew, which is one of the most powerfully known elevators of LDL cholesterol. I'm not fear-mongering. I don't think that we want to drive necessarily our cholesterol as low as possible. That's not in any way what I'm saying. But to needlessly push it up for no reason, I think doesn't make a lot of sense either, especially when you realize that ApoE4 carrier is one of the proposed mechanisms by which it makes us more vulnerable to cardiovascular disease and brain disease is that we seem to be less effective at recycling cholesterol at the point of the liver. And so fiber can help make you a better cholesterol recycler. Caffeine actually can make you a better cholesterol recycler. We found out recently that caffeine is a natural PCSK9 inhibitor, which helps surface the LDL receptor to the surface of the liver, right? Dietary fiber does the same thing. So those are just sort of the considerations that I make, and but I think that those are generally healthy things to for most people, regardless of genotype.
That is so interesting about the French press versus say espresso or something else. I just from the sake of time, I prefer to just have an espresso or pour over.
Yeah.
But for a long time, I did have a lot of French press because it was easy, cheap, whatever.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I was drinking a lot of like buttery coffee for a while, and I was French pressing my coffee, and I saw a 25% drop in my LDL when I went from French pressing my coffee to doing pour over with a paper filter, and when I switched from butter to heavy cream.
Wow.
Yeah, 25%.
Mm-hmm.
And so that might be just for me. That might be something that an ApoE4 carrier would potentially see. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to apply to all people, but that's pretty impressive, right?
That's huge
to have seen that. And again, I eat plenty of like red meat and pork and full fat dairy and things like that. So yeah, that was definitely a cool little like N of 1 study to run.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did an N of 1. I think I told you this, but I used to do a lot of fatty coffee as well. The bulletproof style with the cream with butter and MCT.
It's so good. It's such a crime that it might not be the best for you, and maybe it is good for you. I don't know. I'm just saying that it's so tasty. But I saw when I switched, I saw this like drop, and I have to assume that was a positive intervention.
Totally. Well, it'd be curious for you to do a non-fasted lipid, what's called the lipid load test. So I did a non-fasted blood work session. And I had a bulletproof coffee, I'll just say fatty coffee. And then 90 minutes later, I looked at my triglycerides and they were like 215. Normally mine are fasted around 60. So that to me was too big of a delta that I was comfortable with.
Interesting.
So since then I said, I think I'm just going to do coffee with a little MCT, but you get carried away, like you said, because it tastes good. It's sort of satiating and filling. But I think people need to be aware of like liquid fats as opposed to cooking with butter. This is a different type of deal.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, think about when you put butter in coffee and it melts, it's like a layer of fat at the top of the coffee, right? Cream disperses heavily throughout. So that nature's emulsifier in the case of dairy is essentially a lipoprotein called milk fat globule membrane. And lipoproteins, like your blood is mostly water and you've got fat suspended throughout. And the way that works is that, Mother Nature has devised lipoproteins. So that's essentially what milk fat globule membrane is. It's a lipoprotein that keeps the fats in milk suspended in the aqueous solution of milk, which is like 90-something% water, right? And so that chemical difference is significant. It affects the way that our biology responds to the fat in dairy. Dairy proportionally has more saturated fat, and I'm not demonizing saturated fat, than any other fat source. But it's interesting that consumption of full fat dairy is associated with better cardiometabolic health. And when I say better cardiometabolic health, it's like they're using biomarkers like LDL cholesterol, right? Of like fasting triglycerides, et cetera, et cetera. So, so it's super interesting.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, talking off the cuff here, but something like a chai latte. So if we think about the absorption of curcumin is not very good, right? That's why they use either soy nanoparticle or BioPerine or things like that. I wonder if like making tea with full fat dairy, putting curcumin in there would enhance the absorption, or you could replace curcumin with maybe resveratrol or whatever, due to this milk fat globulin. I'm just thinking, I don't know.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Well, the thing about milk protein they've shown, and I'm I think that this is like splitting hairs really, but what they have shown is that the protein in dairy can bind to some of these polyphenols that are found in coffee, because coffee is a rich source of polyphenols, and make them less bioavailable, but that the dairy fat has the opposite effect, because polyphenols and curcumin too are fat soluble. So you do, especially if you're consuming these, coffee or curcumin on an empty stomach, it does help to have some fat go along with it. But that's why I think heavy cream is really great, because it doesn't have any protein. And it's just basically pure dairy fat with the milk fat globule membrane. So I would think that that heavy cream would make something like curcumin a lot more bioavailable. I'm not so sure about like half and half or whole milk, because they have the dairy protein,
and it might impact the absorption maybe, or some
potentially. I mean, these are all I love talking about this stuff, because it's also interesting. Is like whether or not you use heavy cream or half and half in your morning coffee going to like be a major needle mover in your health? Probably not. I mean, these are like little small things, but if you already eat a primarily whole foods diet and you're exercising and you're sleeping and you're mitigating your stress, then why not tinker with these like smaller interventions to see if they have an effect?
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to talk about, because there's a big push towards plant-based diets now. I was in Salt Lake City, and there was a lot of people our age ordering coffee. I was doing some work there, and not a single person, they all ordered lattes or macchiatos or some such thing, and requested oat milk or almond milk, which does not have these nutrients that we've been talking about. So the question that I have for you is, and I know you have some recent context regarding this, the associations with cognitive function as it relates to consuming a plant-based or vegan diet. What does the evidence really show? Because you just rattled off amazing carnonutrients, vitamin B12, you talked about, carnitine, creatine, carnosine, all these things, amazing for the brain and also mood. So what happens if you go on a vegan diet, and how does that impact?
Yeah, I think you're starving your brain of really potentially valuable nutrients. I mean, B12, obviously, that is a non-trivial data point, right? If you're eating a diet that is depriving your brain of vitamin B12, it's probably not an evolutionarily appropriate diet, right? For somebody, especially for a species with brains as voracious as ours. There's really no evidence to say that the vegan diet is optimal from the standpoint of brain health or even cardiovascular health. With regard to brain health, you can't have a conversation about brain food without bringing up the value of fish, at the very least. Fish provides it's an amazing source of preformed omega-3 fatty acids like docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA. And it's thought that it was access to fish and seafood that helped catalyze the growth of our brains at the dawn of human evolution. So I'm a huge fan of seafood, but I also think that like we can't fearmonger red meat anymore either, because I mean, some of our ancestors didn't live close to the coast, and so they very likely ate the brains of like organ meats, right? Of the brains of animals that they were able to consume. And so, yeah, so I'm a big advocate of the consumption of red meat. I think it provides a bevy of nutrients that we know are important to brain health. Vegans will say, oh, but there's like TMAO, but fish is a massive source of TMAO, right? And we know that fish consumption is associated with better cardiovascular health, better brain health, better health for our offspring, cognitive health. So yeah, I think that to me, it's we don't have all the data because nutrition science is confounded by healthy user bias, and it's very easy to find at the population level links between red meat consumption and every bad health outcome you can imagine. And it's very easy to find links between plant food consumption and every bad outcome or every good outcome you can imagine. So I think nutrition science is a bit limited in that sense. And we don't have long-term randomized controlled multi-center trials where we're putting people on, paleo diet interventions and comparing them to vegan dietary interventions. But to me, it's pretty cut and dry that red meat, eggs, things like that, dairy are really important brain foods.
Mm-hmm. And the neurologists that have recently sort of come after you and said, oh, the things that Max is talking about on the recent Rogan episode, what is their main stance? Is that it's saturated fat, it's animal products are exacerbating or worsening dementia, or are they relying upon this nutritional epidemiology, or what were they trying to refute that you talked about?
Yeah. To be totally honest, I haven't listened to their rebuttal of my episode. But I know vegan's going to vegan. I know all the primary talk points, and they might say something like there's not good evidence. There's no evidence. Well, they would say that there is evidence that eating more red meat is associated with worse brain health and increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. And to me, it's kind of a flimsy rebuttal because, as I mentioned, we know that red meat consumption in the United States is associated with lots of bad things, and that's because people who eat more red meat are more likely to smoke, are more likely to be overweight, are more likely to be sedentary. Most of the meat that Americans consume come from either packaged processed junk foods, fast food, or mixed dishes like burritos and pizzas and things like that, right? Like processed meat on those foods, hot dogs, hamburgers from fast food joints and things like that. 3%, if you want to use saturated fat as a proxy for meat intake, only 3% of the saturated fat that Americans consume come from steaks, like actual just like meat by itself. So it's a very small minority. But yeah, they'll say things like red meat is associated with worse brain health. And I can't refute that because it probably is, if you look at the population level. But when you do more granular research, which is starting to be done, you start to see that the association that meat has with these negative health outcomes, whether it's Alzheimer's disease, but also cardiovascular disease, cancer, and the like, once diet quality is high and a person is consuming adequate fruits and vegetables and things like that, those associations fall away and in fact become inversed. There was a paper by, I forget who, it was a 2020 paper, but basically looked at all-cause cancer and found that once fruit and vegetable consumption was adequate, that the association that unprocessed red meat had with cancer was actually like inversed, And so that's, I think, where you have to really understand the limitations of nutrition science. Like, to illustrate it, you can take a food item like quinoa, right? And look at the population level of all the people who are eating quinoa and look at their long-term health, right? I would bet any amount of money that people who consume more quinoa are going to have more pristine health on any indicator of health, right? But that's because if you know how to pronounce quinoa, chances are you're shopping in health food stores, you're reading health blogs, right? You're mindful of your health and well-being, right? Is that to say that quinoa is causally related to those outcomes that you might observe? No, it's just because quinoa is a health food, right? Like it's a health food. It's got a health halo around it. So that right there in a nutshell is healthy user bias. And it's very easy to find positive health outcomes associated with fruit and vegetable consumption. And it's very easy to find poor health outcomes associated with meat. That's not to say that fruits and vegetables aren't causally connected. I think they are. I think fiber is very important. I think the phytochemicals that we get in fruits and vegetables super, super important. I'm not debating that, but I also think that like you have to be aware of of the fact that it tends to swing in the opposite direction for meat.
That's a great example, and it really illustrates the downsides with epidemiological nutrition research as it relates to fill in the blank condition.
Yeah.
There's nothing magical about it. I do like quinoa occasionally, a little Celtic sea salt or some soy sauce. Like, it tastes pretty good.
Yeah, I'm not shit talking quinoa. Yeah. Like, no offense to the quinoa fans that are listening, but yeah, it's just like, it's a great example of that. It's like another. I mean, you take any health food like or any like really niche health product, right? Like, I'm just off the top of my head, chlorophyll drops, right? Is like something that I bought at Whole Foods recently. Like, if you rounded up all the people in the United States that regularly use chlorophyll drops, right? I guarantee you their health is awesome, especially when compared to the average, right? Is it because of the drops, or is it because like this person is
also doing X, Y, and Z?
Also doing X, Y, Z. He also is able to afford a $40 bottle of chlorophyll drops at Whole Foods, Yeah. So healthy user bias is like really pervasive in this field.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if we talk about assessment tools, we already talked about vision, taste, smell, hearing, the importance of metabolic health, avoiding prediabetes. And we talked about genotype testing, ApoE4 and stuff like that. And I know you talk about these in your book, but if we were to put a button on, okay, am I doing everything I possibly could to possibly prevent dementia, Alzheimer's, maybe Parkinson's in the future? I mean, short of imaging tests, what else can we use to assess, the systemic physiology to make sure that we're supporting our brain? Standard blood work. Is there any other biomarkers that are more sensitive or specific?
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, I think the biomarkers, the blood markers, really are they're great to have a handle on, like your overall metabolic health. Standard panel of biomarkers, whether it's your fasting triglycerides, fasting blood sugar. I think fasting insulin can be useful, can help you get to your HOMA-IR, which is an overall measure of insulin sensitivity. Homocysteine is really important. You want to keep that as low as possible. Your high sensitivity CRP, making sure your inflammation levels are low. Um, all super important. I think omega-3 index valuable.
Mm.
There was a study that found that people that had the highest level of DHA fat in their red blood cells were 50% less likely to develop dementia over, I believe, about 20 years compared to people that had the lowest. And again, that could be healthy user bias as well, right? Because somebody with a lot of DHA in their red blood cells could be taking a fish oil supplement. So it's like, even the recommendations that I make, I'm aware of the potential confounding of this phenomena, right? This healthy user bias. So that's why I try to ground all of the recommendations that I make and what is going to be the what is going to be the do the most good for the most people and be safe at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And affordable.
And affordable,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay. Now, when I was studying brain health, there was a lot about neuroplasticity, learning language, like learning a foreign language, playing an instrument, doing things like crossword puzzles, social connections. What's a hierarchy? I mean, we all have to eat, so we might as well eat healthy. But then in terms of baking these other things and activities, into our life as a tool to not only enhance our quality of life, but also possibly preserve the, functioning of our brain. Where do you rate, learning language, an instrument, going out with friends, all of that?
I think it's all important. I mean, there was a Lancet paper published in 2020 that literally said verbatim, the potential for prevention is high. And it listed 12 different modifiable risk factors for the development of dementia. And social engagement or social isolation, rather, was one of them, major risk factor. Depression, another really important risk factor. As I mentioned, hearing loss, brain injury, another one, excessive alcohol consumption. These are all, I think, really important and really just scraping the surface of, I think, what it means to live brain healthily today. Because the paper didn't even touch on, for example, anticholinergic medication overuse, which is a big problem. For example, like, sleep aids and things like that, chronic use of which associated with dramatically increased risk for dementia. And a lot of people use these kinds of drugs, right? But yeah, excessive air pollution, making sure that you're not, breathing in too many environmental pollutants like fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. But I think, if you live a well-rounded, well-balanced lifestyle, I mean, a lot of this stuff ends up inevitably going on autopilot. Like, I don't think too much about my air pollution, the air pollution that I'm exposed to, because I know, for the most part that I'm in, I know when I'm in an environment with high levels of pollution. Actually, when I was in Bogota, that's when I really felt.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know if you felt the same way,
Mm-mm.
but
because it is overcast and there's the congestion is insane.
It's insane. Yeah. And I don't know if they have, I don't want to to speak out of turn, but like, I don't know if they have the regulation that we have here. But I remember walking around Bogota and feeling like I was like choking in like bus exhaust.
Mm.
But yeah, in terms of a hierarchy, I think you don't want to major in the minors. And I think getting your nutrition right, primarily focusing on a whole foods diet, optimizing for protein, which is going to support metabolic health, staying hydrated, maybe some basic supplementation. As I mentioned, I'm a big fan of magnesium. I think fish oil can be useful. Things like that. Exercise, making sure that you've got a habitual workout routine in place. I think that's crucial. Making sure that your sleep is good. Those are sort of the big sort of heavy hitters. Making sure that you're not chronically stressed out. And then, yeah, I think that's really those are the fundamentals. I mean, obviously you want to keep your brain engaged. You want to build your cognitive reserve. So if that means learning a new language or, picking up a new skill, like I did with boxing over the course of the pandemic, those are all fantastic ideas. But you want to take things one step at a time. You don't want to overwhelm yourself, because then, you're going to feel overwhelmed, and then that's not going to allow for the development of sustainable habits.
So how often do you play the guitar and box? Is it several days a week when you feel like it, or is this like a structured thing? Like,
yeah, I was doing it once a week. I try to do it. Fairly often, although, I think I tend more to like hit the bag because I've developed the body, like the coordination. I did private lessons 1 to 2 times a week for about a year and a half. I do, I think learning to play an instrument is really valuable. I play guitar regularly. I love to sing. So like for me, like getting better at that is like building, that's like a form of skill-based training too. And so, that's something that I'm super passionate about. I aspire to learn another language. I'm always learning new things. I'm always like diving deep into PubMed or Google or, what have you. I think they're all super, super important. I think like retiring, that's like one of the worst things that you could do for your brain health. And I don't think that you probably don't have that many retirees like listening to your show, but if you are retired and you're listening, just make sure to keep your brain engaged, because stagnation is death, certainly with regard to the body, but definitely with regard to the brain. Use it or lose it. I think that applies to so many things in life.
It's so key. When I was 22, my first boss after college and everything said people that retire die. She was in her 60s. And of course, there's not everyone who retires dies, but she was making the point of like, you need to stay stimulated. And that's the people that are retired and very connected with their friends. They travel, they always have stuff going on. They're thriving, right? But if you just retire and work was your life, then of course, that's going to be very challenging for you, right? That was your source of social connection, your meaning, your purpose, like your drive to do things. So yeah, I think it's key to have all these different tools. And I don't know, I learn a lot from travel, observing different cultures, learning the language, interacting with the people. And what I see in American culture is we are so distant from connections. We eat alone, we work alone, we do all and other cultures like friends and family, it's like multiple generations in a household, like that I think is lacking, and you can't really get that from a pill, right? So that's why these conversations are helpful, to encourage people and remind them, about the importance of that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time in my life when I would forego a social opportunity so that I could get my workout in. But I think I'm different these days in the sense that I've already got my workout habitually secure within my lifestyle, right? Like fitness is a huge part of my life. But if there's an important social opportunity that I have to choose between, that presents itself, and I have to choose between like the workout or that social opportunity, I'll go for the social opportunity and I'll skip the workout, because the gym's always going to be there, right? Yeah. But that opportunity I think is golden. And as you get older, I think they become fewer and further in between. I had the privilege of getting to go to Necker Island fairly recently, a couple months ago. And I got to be around Richard Branson, who was like an incredible model to observe. I mean, granted, he's a billionaire. Not all of us are billionaires, but the dude is like, he's in his either late 60s or early 70s or something like that. And he shows no signs of slowing down. Every day he's getting up there. He's like, kite surfing and wind boarding or whatever the hell they call it. And yeah, he's just like his brain and body are just, they're constantly engaged, And I think that's a really important like lesson to learn from the super agers living amongst us.
Mm-hmm. Important point.
Yeah.
And these are things you talk a lot about in your upcoming documentary. Yep.
Yeah. So my film is called Little Empty Boxes, and it's not out yet, but people can watch a trailer at littleemptyboxes.com. And it's the first ever dementia prevention documentary. And it's like, I would say it's about 25% science, but 75% character and narrative. And it focuses on my mom, and it focuses on my why, and why you've been so kind to let me come on your show. I think this is like my third or fourth time on the show over the years, but it's why I do what I do, and why I'm so passionate about getting this message out to people of all walks of life, and why, despite the endless barrage of criticism that I get seemingly on a daily basis, and I know you get it too, Mike, but like why I remain, as committed as ever to my mission and my purpose of helping people get healthier, right? Even if it's going to like anger some diet cult out there, of which there are many. To me, it doesn't matter when you actually see what like dementia looks like.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing more motivating. There's no greater motivating force to run as best you can, as fast as you can in the opposite direction.
Mhm.
And yeah, I saw it firsthand. Like I didn't get into this because I'm a bodybuilder or an athlete. I got into this because I saw real sickness. And I don't think that many people in our space have seen real sickness the way that I've seen it. And the dearth of options available to somebody in that time of need from the allopathic medical system. And so for me, yeah, it's something that I'm going to be screaming from the mountaintops for the rest of my life.
That's awesome. I love that. I mean, just having meaning and purpose in and of itself probably protects the brain, but it's certainly meaningful work, I think, is lacking for a lot of people. They go to their work and they hate their work, right? And so you are inspiring a lot of people. And I think we all need to find what that sort of mastery is. Like for you, that's helping people understand how to preserve the cognitive capacities of their brain. For other people, it might be singing or gardening, right? And so we need to strive for that mastery, which is important. So you have a new book out. Well, newish. It's February, or I'm sorry, March. Last year. Genius Foods.
Genius Kitchen.
Genius Kitchen.
Yeah. Foods was the first. Kitchen was the last. It just came out as a cookbook companion to Genius Foods. But there's a lot of good information in it too,
Nice.
where my thinking has sort of evolved on like dairy, for example. So yeah, it's like a 2-in-1 wellness guide and cookbook. Really beautiful like photos and really tasty dishes of varying complexity in the book. So yeah, people should definitely check it out. I think cooking together is one of these like low hanging fruit that, even before we start talking about macros and protein and all the things that we love to geek out over, cooking at home is one of these like major points of leverage for most people. Because when you can make the same dish at home that you get out at a restaurant, it's going to be cheaper. It's going to have fewer calories, higher quality ingredients. You know exactly what's going into your food. So yeah, I'm a big fan of eating at home. And cooking is a skill that I think could be cultivated by anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a trained chef, but I've developed my skills in the kitchen. I did it with my mom. When my mom ceased to be able to cook for the family, I stepped into that role. And then over the course of the pandemic, I got a ton of experience, right? Because restaurants were closed. So I had to learn how to make, keep dishes like new and interesting and tasty to feed like my family, my grubby little brothers.
Yeah.
So,
and was that the impetus to create the book then?
Yeah, I wanted to celebrate the joy of eating and cooking with the book. Yeah. It's definitely a book that like it's a cookbook with recipes clearly created by somebody who's health conscious. Like it's a gluten-free book. It's a largely dairy-free book. And the reason why I made it dairy-free is because I know that people still have like, you don't need to eat dairy, and people still have sort of like mixed opinions on it. I know that like 75% of the global adult population is lactose intolerant. And you can throw in the dairy if you want. It's sort of like optional, but it's fully gluten-free. It's largely dairy-free. And it centers around whole food animal products and plants.
That's awesome.
Which I think is the way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the way.
Yeah. Well, going back to tactile, right? When we talked about exercise and the importance of like using your hands, when you're cooking, it's tactile. You're introducing novelty. You're looking up new ingredients, combining, cumin with paprika, whatever it may be. And so you're learning that. And so I think it's important for the brain, but also in and of itself is a form of, introducing novelty, which I think is very important.
Yeah, novelty is super important. You're learning as you go. You're learning all these like cooking techniques that I think are super valuable. And it's like, it feels very like ancient to know how to cook a piece of meat over fire. I think feels super ancient. You feel like you're connected to your ancestral past, or at least I do. But there is good data on people who eat home more frequently. They have improved family dynamics. They have better metabolic health. They tend to have lower BMIs, which I know is imperfect. Body composition measurement, but it's BMI is how we screen for obesity generally. And so yeah, I think that like it's all good, right? And especially today where we live in a time of economic tumult, it's a great way to economize, right? There's all kinds of wherever you live in the country, you have like these mail order services now that provide pristine quality food to you right at your doorstep. Um, so yeah, and food is like, it's not the only lever that people have at their disposal, but it is a major one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a major one. And I think that food should be enjoyed. Like, yeah, food, there's like this whole science associated with it. And we love to talk about nutrition, but a lot of people have fractured, is the word I was looking for, relationships with food. And I think that's a real tragedy, especially, from my vantage point. It's food is something that's really easy to take for granted. But when I saw my mom in the last months of her life, just being able to eat was something that was a real like luxury, and something that didn't last forever. So yeah, I think it's definitely something worth celebrating. And yeah, and if you can do it sitting across the table from your loved ones smiling back at you, then you've got the whole social engagement piece. It's game, set, match.
It's huge. I mean, the big concern people have is I don't have time. That's what they say. I don't have time to cook. I don't have time to do this. But you see people spend 4 or 6 hours a day on Instagram or whatever. It's like you can carve out the time. You can make the time, or you get a crock pot slow cooker. I mean, there's so many things you can do.
Yeah. I mean, my cookbook, obviously, like, I didn't want people to like buy, spend $30 or whatever on the cookbook and then see these like really basic recipes. So there's the recipes range in their complexity, but I did provide guidance in terms of how to make really simple things, because I am aware that people have, their schedules are pretty tight. So when just making like a basic steak, I think it's not something that most people know how to do, or even like a burger. Most people don't even know how to make a simple burger patty. It's one of the quickest and most cost-effective ways to get really good nutrition into your body. Poach an egg. Like, I think knowing how to poach eggs, crucially important. Most people don't know how to do it. So there is guidance for some of those like staples, in there. But on social media, I share all the time like snacks and meals that I enjoy that are very, very simple. I mean, I love, one of my favorite snacks these days is I just do like fat-free Greek yogurt. Again, not because I'm afraid of dairy fat. I think dairy fat is very valuable, but it's just a great protein supplement. And I mix in some whey protein. I throw some bee pollen on top, some frozen wild berries, blueberries from Whole Foods, maybe some cacao nibs or some hemp seeds. And I've got like a 40-50 gram of protein like snack, and it's so satiating. And so I wouldn't, necessarily include something like that in the cookbook that people are paying for. But yeah, eating healthily on the go doesn't have to be, it's not rocket science. You just have to like be aware of like, you just have to have in your back pocket, like just a few staple healthy recipes to be able to deploy. And yeah. And so the cookbook definitely has a few of those.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think the books are nice because they give people it helps create new habits when they go to the store, because you see people, they buy the bread, they buy the pasta, they buy candy, they buy the same stuff. We're kind of these creatures of habit. And so when you have a new cookbook, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to buy this instead of that, and you start making these healthy swaps. So I think that's key, because I find myself buying the same like 30 foods or whatever it is. And so it's nice to have, learn new recipes, new ways of cooking things.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, there was research from Tufts University that came out that found that people that more closely adhered to the idea of eating everything in moderation ended up consuming more sugar sweetened beverages, confectionery products, refined grain products. Actually, the healthiest people kind of eat more similar to you in that they buy a narrower range of more healthful foods, and they just buy those same foods on loop. And I do that. I mean, I go to the supermarket, and I generally am buying the same thing every time I go. I mean, I buy like, I'm always refilling like my Honeycrisp apple supply. I'm always generally buying some cottage cheese, which I really like. The Greek yogurt, I buy eggs. If I need like meat in the house, I'll buy some grass-fed, grass-finished beef, heavy cream. But that's generally it. Like, I buy a pretty narrow range of products, and I just buy those. I feel very, it also reduces decision fatigue, which is a big issue. And yeah, so that's served me pretty well over the years.
That's awesome. Yeah. And then sometimes when you go to the store hungry, then you just know what you're going to get, as opposed to all the impulse stuff, or I'm going to try this or try that. So
yeah, I definitely love trying new things. So, I mean, I go to like in LA, we have Erewhon, which is this mecca if you've never been for the sort of Whole Foods wellness movement. There's a lot of BS in the store, but there's a lot of like really cool, innovative products. Like kombucha is now a household term, but back when nobody knew what kombucha was, Erewhon was the place that would have it. And place can be pretty overpriced. So this is not meant to be like an ad for that store. But I love just like wandering the aisles and like picking out like the new latest and greatest like trend, even if it's just to try it, you know?
It's amazing. I don't even want to know how expensive it is now with inflation. I haven't been there yet on this trip. I'm going to go later today. But
Nice.
I mean, it was expensive before inflation and gas and this. I'm sure now you're like, can't leave there without spending $70.
Dude, yeah, it's nuts. It's like way too expensive. I've spent way too much of my hard-earned money at that supermarket, but
You feel good.
But yeah, I feel good, and it's one of the things that I love doing is like trying new things. I even, I'll occasionally buy supplements that like I know probably I'm not gonna stick to over the long term, but I want to see how they make me feel, and a lot of the time I know that I'm not gonna feel any different, but I just like it. I think that that's like one of the most, I just like derive a lot of joy from it. I got interested in fitness early on from my exposure to like supplements and things like that. So yeah, to me, it's like super exciting, like bringing a new supplement home and trying it out.
Totally. Max Lugavere, really appreciate you coming on the show. I'll put links to your books and Little Tiny Boxes as well, so people can
Thank you,
check
dude.
that out. And yeah, keep up the good work.
Means a lot. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, bud.